The writer getting the most media oxygen lately is David Foster Wallace. And one of the reasons for this is there's a new movie out called The End of the Tour, directed by James Ponsoldt and starring Jason Segel and Jesse Eisenberg. And because this is a literary show, I am contractually bound to tell you it's based on a book by David Lipsky, a book called Although Of Course You End Up Becoming Yourself. Tom, you went on a press junket where they were promoting this movie. And of course, the movie is about a book tour, and irony layers on irony.
This has to be a little bit meta for you guys, right? You're doing days of interviews about a movie about days of interviews.
Yeah.
And are you finding any of the same things happening to yourselves, that you're feeling the resentment of the interviewers?
No,
not until now.
Yeah,
just kidding.
I actually think it's funny, but this is a movie that really resonates with interviewers because it's a subject they're so familiar with, and it brings up these interesting questions about like where is the line, especially as sort of technology and interviewing has really changed. Like where is the line between good taste and doing your job as an interviewer?
Yes, right. Well, I'm going to try to cross that line.
Absolutely,
yeah. I see that as my job.
You know what I would love to do, man? I would love to do a profile on one of you guys who's doing a profile on me.
That is
Or is
interesting.
that too pomo and cute? I don't know.
Maybe for Rolling Stone, but
It would be interesting, though.
You think?
I'm sorry, man.
What's wrong?
It's just you're going to go back to New York and, like, sit at your desk and shape this thing however you want. And that, I mean, to me, it's just extremely disturbing.
Why is it disturbing?
Because I think I would like to shape the impression of me that's coming across.
I see.
Yeah.
I understand.
I don't even know if I like you yet. So nervous about whether you like me.
And now the Lipsky book is in interview form, obviously, as well, and then the screenplay is a distillation of that set of interviews. But to prepare for it, you listen to the tapes themselves as well as reading the book. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I had read Lipsky's book when it came out, and then Donald's script he wrote from the book, from speaking to Lipsky. Donald did not listen to the tapes. I spoke to Lipsky and asked him if I could have the tapes, and then made them available to both Jason and Jesse, and they were a great resource, but it was also sort of something we were very clear that we didn't want to do impersonations of these people.
Yeah, well, it was really helpful to me, especially there's some weighty conversation in the movie and some very tense scenes.
Of course.
What was really important to me when I listened to those tapes was to realize that there's also a lot of fun, and it's 4 guys with 2 guys, 4 days with 2 guys in a car. You're bound to drop any artifice and at some point start talking about what's on the radio. And that was what was really interesting about the tapes to me, is they also just like shot the shit. I don't know, can I say that on this?
Yes.
Yeah, great.
For us, you can. Yeah. And let's talk a little bit about constructing the character, your character. You work together, obviously, to figure out how to take what's basically a lot of internal stuff and externalize it. Did the screenplay, was it built to do that already, or did you have to figure out?
Well, you know, the screenplay is taken from the actual interviews.
Right.
So really a lot of what I had to say was straight out of David Foster Wallace's mouth. That was very helpful. I didn't have to second guess if any of that stuff was correct. It was said. And then it was sort of a narrative was created by Donald Margulies, who's as talented a writer as exists on this planet. And so I had like total confidence in the words. I wanted to get them exactly right. And I wanted to do some of the external stuff in a way that honored the fact that this is a real man who means a lot to a lot of people and has family and things like that. What was most important to me, though, was to capture the heart of it and the spirit of it, because I think that the movie is a real extension of David Foster Wallace's writing. I feel like the same themes we explore in this are what he explored in This Is Water and in Infinite Jest. This question of, hey, is anyone else finding that maybe they've been lied to, that we've been told that we're going to feel a certain way if we achieve these things, and then you get there and it doesn't exist?
There's a you talk movingly about reading Infinite Jest, and part of that is the idea that there's a kind of philosophical version of what you just said, which is that this is what we, at some point you realize the world is not as we were told. But you also talk about it as a life stage, as a moment at which you right?
Yeah, well, I think you spend your 20s and maybe your early 30s, or I guess it varies from person to person, but trying to get there. Then you find out that there does not exist, and it just keeps moving, and like, in a lot of ways, sort of equidistant from where you started. It's just you never even get any closer. I think human nature is that you narrow the criteria of success so that you're always losing. Like once you accomplish something, you move the standard away from you for some reason. And then there's this suggestion that David Foster Wallace offers of, well, what if you place your values somewhere else? What if it's being a good friend and showing up for the people around you and, just being a part of what's going on, no better, no worse? Then, surprise, you're there already,
And James, you see this. You see David Foster Wallace's work as in a continuum of American and European innovative literature. So you talk about Gertrude Stein, James Joyce, and then Tom Wolfe and Kerouac are the four that I've seen you mention in relation to this. The first two famous for kind of structural formalist innovation, and the next two famous for their relation to the real. To the idea of the real. And both of these are fundamental Wallace concerns.
Yeah, well, I think when Wallace came out of college, went to Arizona for his MFA, the fiction that was in vogue at the time was sort of a type of Raymond Carver realism, which he certainly wasn't. I think he was harkening back, 20-odd years, 15, 20 years, to postmodernists of the 60s, people who were... fabulous, right? Writing absurdist literature, the Pynchons, the Barths, stuff like that. Stuff that wasn't necessarily in vogue at the time. And I think, though, when Infinite Jest came out, and when Shipping Out, the essay that was retitled Supposedly Fun Thing I'll Never Do Again, came out, more or less the same time, there was a sense, which was described to me by someone as verbal cocaine. There was the sense that something in fiction had shifted, that someone was writing for our generation. That's sort of some of those authors that I mentioned and that sort of come up in dialogue. It's that suddenly there's a new way of writing, and I think for fans of Wallace and for people that read Wallace's essays or Infinite Jest or jumped from one to the other, there was a sense that someone was able to articulate the experience of being alive in the 1990s, of feeling that there's so many opportunities for entertainment and pleasure, so many things pulling at our attention, more and more tiny screens popping up, things that seem prescient now that he was talking about almost 20 years ago, that he was able to articulate that in his writing, which I think people felt that now a young writer like, say, a David Lipsky would have to contend with that. Yeah,
and of course, Gertrude Stein felt the same way to her audience, right? Like that she somehow had figured out modernism before it happened.
Sure.
Right.
Yep.
Do you feel that by concentrating on this little section of time, this little short piece of time, you got away from the problems of the biopic?
For me, the problems of the biopic, with a film, when you have 100 to 120 minutes, that's just not a lot of time. And I think what you get, the clichés of the biopic, are things that there's a type of easy pop psychology or easy conclusions, easy through lines that are drawn. Someone stung by a bee when they're 7. That sort of can predict why they're going to have success or failure or marriage or divorce 30 years later. They simply can't. That's reductive, and that's sort of someone trying to conform to a 3-act structure. People's lives are messy and complicated, and people have mysterious inner lives. So I wouldn't know how to have that sort of, or how to even aim for that omniscient sort of God's eye perspective. What we had an opportunity for here was to tell a hyper-subjective story about David Lipsky's experience spending several days with someone who was a stranger to him, but who he'd thought about a lot and was probably measuring himself against a little bit, as every young author was at the time. And we're speaking to that experience while hopefully honoring the memory of David Foster Wallace.
We had a fantastic conversation. I was incredibly impressed by both of them. They knew their Foster Wallace. They had very smart things to say about the nature of the project that they were doing, about the psychology of that Lipsky-Wallace interface, and there's just one of those conversations, one of those literary conversations that was just superb.
And by let me stop you for a second. By Lipsky-Wallace interface, you mean?
Well, the film is about the 3-day Rolling Stone interview that David Lipsky did with David Foster Wallace right after Infinite Jest came out, I believe.
Yeah, and interestingly, the piece that Lipsky wrote never appeared in Rolling Stone.
Right, but it appeared as a book much later, after Wallace had died.
What'd you think of the film, Tom?
I loved it. I thought I did. I just loved it. I thought it was it's a tough thing to do, to write, have a movie about writing. It's a nothing really happens. I mean, you can't imagine this as a studio pitch, this film, right? It's just two guys talking. They both have their issues. They both have the stuff that they're worried about. And they both are managing their own impression of each other. And it's just a little chess game. And I think it's a beautiful little film.
Laurie, what do you think?
I think I had the discomfort that one has when one sees one's own profession depicted, because I have done a lot of interviews and magazine interviews, and to see what you do depicted can make you very uncomfortable, especially when it is a morally questionable, as Janet Malcolm says, morally indefensible profession, in that you are acting as if you're the subject's best friend and you want to know everything about him, which you do, but for very selfish reasons, and you will throw him under the bus in a second if it's going to make your story better. And I remember, if I could just do this really briefly, when I was doing reporting about theater, and those personalities in the theater are so colorful and crazy. And if I had the experience where the person I was talking to would say something really colorful and funny and hilarious that I knew would damage that person, I had this experience, which was just sit perfectly still. Don't show that don't in any way tip your hand that you're loving this, because it could stop. And
This is why you're such a good poker player.
Well, I remember Laurie told me a story about interviewing Geraldo Rivera when she was a young woman, and she goes into the room and Geraldo is coming off set, and the first thing he does is change his shirt in front of the 20-something female interviewer. Slowly takes his shirt off and basically does a striptease for her.
And that is a great feeling, because you want to skewer Geraldo. I mean, he deserves it. He's looking for it. So if he's showboating in front of you, it feels great.
Sure, but the movie does the opposite of skewering. It's a hagiography. The performances are terrific. I think Jason Segel is a revelation. What's interesting to me is the David Foster Wallace of it all, because I remember the 1970s pretty vividly, when there was a writer who was in the book bag of everyone at every college. All students in high school and college who were at all literarily inclined were reading his books. He gave a library dedication at my undergraduate school and was greeted like Mick Jagger. And that was Kurt Vonnegut. Mm-hmm. And Kurt Vonnegut, these years later, 40-odd years later, is, well, not forgotten. He is not in that place in the pantheon that he occupied back then. And I wonder if that is not where David Foster Wallace is headed.
I do not think that is where David Foster Wallace is headed. Time will tell.
I think that there is something about Wallace's work which really attracts young readers, and it probably will continue to do that. I'm not sure that I've said this before, but I think that reading goes in stages, like Erickson's life stages, and that when you're in your identity crisis, books about identity are really important. When you're in your intimacy crisis, books about intimacy are really important. And I don't know, my stage of life, which is codgerdom, it's a different kind of relation to the written word, and a different kind of relation to those problems. Now, what the film did, I thought, was take those kinds of issues. Wallace is worried about how he's going to be perceived by this, what he sees as this kind of slick interviewer from a slick magazine, Rolling Stone. And Lipsky is very concerned about how he's going to be perceived by a literary idol who's getting all of the attention that Lipsky wished he could get himself as a novelist, and he's not getting. And so they're both kind of fighting their own battles about their own identities and about their own senses of self. And I found it completely compelling. And that suggests that perhaps these issues, which are fundamental to Wallace's work, will continue to be found compelling for readers for time immemorial.
No, maybe. At any rate, the movie is worth seeing. It's called The End of the Tour.